Most people experience thoughts as private events. A thought appears internally, and because no one else can directly observe it, it feels personal by default. This creates the assumption that the mind is fundamentally self-generated. You may question your emotions, your memories, even your decisions, but most people still believe their internal voice belongs entirely to them. The problem is that thoughts do not emerge from nowhere. The structure of thinking is built gradually through exposure, repetition, language, imitation, emotional conditioning, and social reinforcement, long before conscious awareness fully recognizes what is happening. Every word you use to think was learned externally. Every emotional association attached to those words developed through interaction with environments, people, and repeated experiences. Even the categories through which you interpret reality were inherited socially before they felt internal. This does not mean people are consciously controlling your mind. The process is subtler than that. The mind absorbs patterns continuously because adaptation requires integration with the surrounding environment. Over time, external structures become internal thinking systems. The transition is so gradual that the borrowed structure disappears beneath familiarity. The resulting thoughts feel self-generated because the mind no longer remembers their origin. But much of what you experience as your thinking was shaped through repeated external influence operating beneath awareness across years of exposure. The internal voice feels personal because the conditioning became integrated deeply enough to feel indistinguishable from the self. Language is one of the strongest forces shaping thought because thought itself depends heavily on conceptual structure. You do not simply use language to communicate pre-existing ideas. Language organizes how ideas become mentally available in the first place. Words divide reality into categories, establish emotional associations, and create interpretive frameworks the mind begins using automatically. Once concepts are learned repeatedly, perception itself starts passing through those conceptual filters. Certain emotional experiences become easier to recognize because language gave them structure. Certain interpretations become more automatic because culture repeatedly reinforced them verbally. This means that thoughts appearing inside your mind are already constrained by systems you inherited before conscious awareness developed the ability to evaluate them critically. The mind then mistakes familiarity for originality. Thoughts feel self-generated because they appear internally, but the architecture producing them was socially learned. Even inner dialogue often reflects repeated tones, phrases, reactions, and assumptions absorbed from parents, peers, institutions, media, and culture over long periods of reinforcement. The internal voice may feel private, but its structure is deeply shaped by external systems operating long before the voice felt like you. Imitation shapes thought more than most people realize, because the human nervous system constantly mirrors external behavior automatically. Emotional reactions, conversational rhythms, attitudes, and even patterns of attention are absorbed socially through repeated exposure. This process begins early because adaptation depends on learning from surrounding behavior efficiently. Children do not consciously choose most of the emotional patterns they develop. They absorb reactions, tensions, priorities, fears, and relational dynamics through observation and repetition. Over time, these repeated external patterns become internal expectations about how reality works. The same mechanism continues into adulthood. People unconsciously adapt their language, beliefs, emotional intensity, humor, values, and reactions based on social environments. Most of this adaptation happens beneath awareness because social synchronization reduces uncertainty and strengthens belonging. The resulting thoughts then feel internally generated even when they emerged from prolonged exposure to repeated external patterns. This is why spending time in different environments can dramatically alter thinking without the person noticing the transition clearly. The nervous system continuously absorbs structures from surrounding reality and integrates them into the internal experience of selfhood automatically. Emotionally charged experiences strengthen external influence because emotionally intense information receives priority inside memory and prediction systems. Criticism repeated emotionally becomes internal self-talk. Fear repeated socially becomes internal anxiety frameworks. Expectations repeated by authority figures become subconscious standards the mind later mistakes for personal beliefs. Once emotionally reinforced patterns become integrated, they continue reproducing themselves internally without requiring external reinforcement anymore. The voice that once came from outside becomes psychologically self-sustaining. This is why many people continue hearing forms of criticism internally long after the original environment disappeared. The nervous system learned the pattern deeply enough that it became automated thought structure. Over time, the original source becomes less important than the repetition itself. Now feels personal because the system continuously regenerates it internally. But the emotional architecture shaping the thought was constructed relationally and socially before it ever felt self-generated. Attention is also shaped externally in ways that quietly alter thought itself. What you repeatedly consume changes what your mind begins prioritizing automatically. Social media, news cycles, algorithms, advertising systems, and cultural trends continuously compete for attention because repeated attention changes emotional salience over time. The more often certain ideas, fears, values, or emotional reactions appear, the more psychologically familiar and important they begin feeling. Eventually, the mind starts generating related thoughts automatically because repeated exposure increased accessibility. This creates a feedback loop where externally repeated information becomes internally recurring thought. The process feels natural because the thoughts now appear spontaneously. But spontaneity does not mean independence. The mind continuously reorganizes itself around repeated informational environments. Attention becomes conditioned toward whatever receives reinforcement frequently enough. And because modern environments expose people to constant streams of emotionally weighted information, external systems increasingly participate in shaping internal mental landscapes beneath conscious awareness. Beliefs feel deeply personal because the mind experiences coherence as truth. Once a belief becomes integrated into identity, contradictory information creates psychological tension automatically. This tension encourages the system to preserve existing frameworks rather than reevaluate them constantly. The result is that socially learned ideas often become emotionally protected long after their origins are forgotten. A person may defend beliefs intensely while remaining unaware of how heavily those beliefs were shaped by environment, upbringing, repeated exposure, and cultural reinforcement. The belief feels self-generated because it became woven into the structure of identity itself. But identity frequently forms around inherited assumptions absorbed before critical awareness fully developed. Over time, the mind begins selectively noticing evidence that reinforces the existing framework while filtering out experiences that threaten coherence. This creates the sensation that reality itself confirms the belief independently, even though perception is already organized around maintaining the structure internally. The illusion of completely private thought becomes stronger because consciousness experiences only the final output of mental processing rather than the hidden influences shaping it underneath. Thoughts appear already formed. You rarely observe the chain of emotional associations, environmental exposure, memory activation, prediction systems, and learned conceptual structures that generated them. The finished thought enters awareness fully assembled, creating the impression that it emerged independently from a unified self. But much of the underlying architecture was constructed incrementally through repeated external reinforcement over time. The mind hides this process because conscious awareness depends on simplified coherence to function efficiently. If every thought arrived alongside full awareness of all conditioning influences contributing to it, mental processing would become overwhelmingly unstable. The system therefore compresses complexity into the simpler experience of "I thought this." That simplification preserves continuity, but conceals how socially constructed many internal patterns actually are. This does not mean individuality is fake, or that people are passive recipients of external programming. The mind is not an empty container being filled mechanically. External influence interacts with existing emotional structures, nervous system tendencies, memory patterns, and personal experiences continuously. But individuality itself emerges partly through how the system organizes, reinforces, and stabilizes repeated external inputs over time. The self becomes a constructed arrangement of influences integrated deeply enough to feel internally unified. What feels most personal is often what has been repeated long enough to become psychologically invisible. The more familiar a thought structure becomes, the less external it appears. Eventually, the distinction between internal and external origins becomes difficult to detect because the repeated influence was fully absorbed into the identity structure itself. The unsettling realization is not that your thoughts are controlled by someone else. It is that thinking itself emerges through systems of conditioning, imitation, language, repetition, emotional reinforcement, and social exposure operating continuously beneath awareness. The mind builds itself relationally. Even the internal voice develops through interaction with external environments before it stabilizes into something recognizable as you. Once this becomes visible, certainty changes. Thoughts still appear automatically. Opinions still feel convincing. Emotional reactions still feel immediate. But they lose some of their absolute authority because the hidden architecture shaping them becomes harder to ignore. The question shifts from "what do I think?" to "how did this pattern of thinking become familiar enough to feel like mine?" That shift changes the relationship between awareness and identity completely. Instead of treating every internal thought as direct self-expression, you begin recognizing thought as a dynamic process shaped by countless interactions between nervous systems, environments, language structures, emotional conditioning, repeated exposure, and social reinforcement across time. The goal is not to eliminate influence, because human consciousness develops through influence inevitably. The goal is to notice how much of what feels deeply personal was gradually constructed through repetition before conscious awareness had the ability to evaluate it independently. Once that becomes visible, thoughts stop feeling completely transparent. They begin appearing as patterns emerging from systems larger than the individual mind itself, systems that quietly shape the structure of inner experience long before the internal voice ever started sounding like you. One reason externally shaped thoughts feel so convincing is because the mind confuses familiarity with authorship. A thought that appears repeatedly over long periods begins feeling self-generated simply because the system no longer experiences resistance around it. The repetition removes psychological distance between the thought and the self. Eventually, the person stops noticing the thought as a pattern and starts experiencing it as instinct, intuition, common sense, or personal truth. This transition is important because repeated exposure changes not only what the mind believes, but also what the mind experiences as obvious. Ideas reinforced socially and emotionally over time become cognitively effortless to access. Ease of access then creates the sensation that the thought originated naturally from within, but ease is often the result of conditioning rather than originality. The nervous system continuously strengthens pathways it uses repeatedly, regardless of whether those pathways were consciously chosen in the beginning. Over time, inherited emotional reactions, learned interpretations, and socially reinforced assumptions become so psychologically efficient that alternatives feel unnatural by comparison. The person then defends the repeated pattern not because it was independently constructed, but because familiarity itself became emotionally stabilizing. The thought now feels inseparable from identity, and because identity continuity reduces uncertainty, the system automatically protects the pattern while forgetting how much of its structure emerged through external repetition long before it felt internally authentic. The deeper realization is that the self does not form in isolation first, and then begin thinking independently afterward. The self itself emerges through interaction. Thought develops relationally, emotionally, socially, linguistically, and environmentally from the beginning. Every environment leaves traces inside perception. Every repeated emotional dynamic alters future interpretation. Every social structure teaches the nervous system what to notice, what to fear, what to desire, and what to ignore. Over time, these repeated influences become integrated deeply enough that they stop feeling external altogether. The individual then experiences a highly stabilized internal world, while remaining mostly unaware of how much of that world was assembled through years of absorbed patterns operating beneath awareness. This does not erase individuality, but it changes what individuality actually means. The mind becomes less like an isolated source of original thought, and more like a living system continuously shaped by interaction, repetition, adaptation, and reinforcement across time. Once that becomes visible, the question is no longer whether your thoughts are really yours in some absolute sense. The question becomes how many invisible systems participated in shaping the internal voice long before you realized you were listening to it as yourself.